Let's talk about process. You've mentioned improvisation, but before we get onto that, what do you tend to start with when you set out to make a new show?
It depends a lot. I mean, we've made many different projects, obviously. Occasionally there's something that starts from already a specific idea, you know, so something like The Notebook, which we did recently, which is based on a novel by Agatha Christoph, or Exquisite Pain, or something like Tomorrow's Parties. We actually did have already the idea that that piece was somehow about the future and about hope. So those pieces, in a sense, there's an object or there's a concept on the table already, which we then begin to interrogate and sort of figure out how to deal with this. But those are probably relatively unusual. And more usual is that the pieces begin with the 6 of us, the 5 performers and me, plus whatever guests are coming in for a particular project, in a room, basically not really knowing what we're doing. We might have been obliged to invent a title before then, or even a description, which is can be chastening. But normally we're just sitting there saying, okay, what's next, you know? So
improvisation in that becomes a kind of generation machine. What are the sort of techniques that you use, and how does that play out in a process?
I mean, I think we start with, if we're lucky, that discussion about what we're going to do might have a small little shopping list of ideas. Maybe that somebody would talk about this, or that they might be wearing that, or that this kind of music might be interesting to work with, or would these objects be interesting in the work, in the space? It can be any of these things. I mean, and I think often the big thing for us is that we tend to be driven by concrete things. So a costume that already, in a sense, starts to imply and carry with it all kinds of content. You know, obviously, if you dress somebody as a skeleton in a sort of stupid pantomime skeleton costume, which we have done on more than one occasion, it brings something into the room. You know, you're already dealing with something. We're much more interested, I suppose, in that approach, which is to have material things, even if a material thing is a text, and put it in the room and then see what happens with it, than if we would sit down and say, we're going to make a piece about optimism in late capitalism. I mean, you know, like, for me, that's like, doesn't bring anything to mind. And when it's in a way very easy to say, we're going to make a piece about this, and everybody can sign up for that because it's intelligible as a desire. But I don't think it's particularly generative in terms of what are you actually going to do. So we're almost the opposite. We're more like, what we're going to do is this, and then you're slowly figuring out how to manipulate that and what's implicit in the kind of work that you've started to make. And techniques-wise, I mean, basically trying things. People going into the studio space with either very explicit instructions from me coming out of the discussion, do this and you do that and you do that and let's see what happens. That's explicit. To all the way through to sort of, well, maybe we'll do those 3 things that we know about, and then we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll put some of this music on that we've been talking about. So it's super exploratory and open. And I think what we're looking for is just, in a way, it only has to be one moment where suddenly the temperature in the room changes and you kind of think, oh, okay, like something's really happening now.
There's a tendency in this country, in British theatre, to put devised work in opposition to writing and text. What role does writing, specifically your writing, play within Forced Entertainment's work?
Historically, it was an important part of the work, in that many of the sort of early to mid shows were really based in writing. And occasionally now there's a show that will be built on writing in that way. But I would say the general movement has been towards text that comes out of improvisation. But it's interesting because I still care very much and take care very much of text. So one of the things that I do in rehearsals a lot is either whisper or shout to people, like, talk about this, or talk about this and then go there, or just no, or yes, more of that. Like, so in a way it's a strange process of, it is a process of writing, I think, but it's one that's sort of done on the fly and sort of between the different elements of me as a director and person that works with text, and the performers who are also working with text. And we're sort of batting things backwards and forwards. You know, I'll make some suggestions, I might even write a few things down and give them to people. And then the text grows in this sort of way. We work a lot with the video camera. We record pretty much every improvisation, and we transcribe and we study what people said and how the text bounced from one person to another, or when this person was interrupting, or what was the drift of this text that somebody did. And yet often kind of cardinal moments in that will be because I've sort of sidled up to somebody and said, you know, shift it that way or something. I mean, not always, but I think that it's a sort of weird, organic, collaborative sort of process, like everything else in the work, actually.
There's a sense in your recent work, the last sort of, 5-6 years, that having been very sceptical about narrative at the start, and story, you've kind of come around to embrace it. Shows like Void Story, The Coming Storm, even into The Notebook and The Complete Works, Tabletop Shakespeare's. Suddenly story's right back at the heart of it. What's been interesting about that?
It has been interesting. I mean, I think, you know, some of, certainly Coming Storm is still in that mode where we're rarely, if ever, finishing stories. So we're sort of throwing chunks of story up in the air, but we're refusing to close. And then I think, interestingly, The Notebook, Void Story, and the Shakespeare pieces, they're pretty much, you know, this is really new for us because we're really drawing complete narrative arcs. And obviously you've got a very powerful, so in The Notebook you've got an amazingly powerful engine that allows us to do something fairly extraordinary in terms of the minimalism and the sort of time of that piece. It's slow and very minimalist, not very theatrically expressive anyway. But the narrative's so strong that you almost only have to put it there, and that's our feeling anyway. Would be ashamed to animate it too much. It just is there, and then it's super compelling, and it really draws you along this line of the piece. So I think we've been very interested in that. Very interested, I think, in the Shakespeare pieces. It's almost as though, and there's many things you can be interested in Shakespeare for, the writing, the poetry, all of that stuff. But actually, to just look at them as plot architectures is slightly perverse, but it's also interesting. Like they're all little machines, you know. And I think every one of we did all 36 of them as 1 hour long tabletop events with domestic objects standing in for the characters. So effectively as diagrams of the structures. And I think, you know, every one of them becomes visible as a kind of a little clockwork mechanism. So I think in all of those things you see us, I think approaching that thing, which is the complete narrative architecture, sort of puzzling about it, and I think wondering what we can do with it in different ways.